this video I'm going to talk about making use of the Quadspinner MDK in terrains and a bit of mixing. I'll try and mix some basic knowledge in here as well for some people that may be starting up. This is an example of just pulling some of those elements together into one final mesh, and I've mixed a bunch of nodes together, so I'll talk about that, and I'll show one more example and we'll make one. So here's another example of the same kind of thing rendered out, just a preview render, and here's a final render of another example using the same kind of idea. So this kind of method can produce some fairly nice, interesting results, leading to a decent kind of final mountain. Okay, so let's start off with a basic scene. I'm just going to go ahead and left click on creating a fractal terrain. And if you're kind of new to this, I'm just using some my hotkeys for mine. There's a number of different setups that you can use to make your view experience a little bit better. So I'm going to be talking in terms of using these particular keys. For this, I'm going to go ahead and use my Alt hotkeys so that I can maneuver, and middle mouse button. And it's better to use the wheel mouse instead of the right mouse button to zoom in and out, because the wheel does dollying, whereas the actual right mouse button will zoom in and zoom out without moving the camera. An alternate way of maneuvering in this environment is to go ahead and take the camera and go to this tab over here and tell it to track the terrain. When you do this, you have the possibility of moving this and it will always aim towards it, which is much more like working in a 3D program where you orbit around the objects, so that you can really kind of plan what you're going to look at, and that works a little bit better. We could still kind of navigate and look around, but ultimately this will put us in the right kind of mode, and then we'll just kind of adjust our shot as needed. And you can just turn that off, no track, and return back to your base tab. So to get into here and start playing with it, we want to double click, and that will bring up our terrain editor. And within here, I've got a few things that I've changed here. You can have just the terrain view where you see the different height map, or you can just turn on the material by turning on the paintbrush mode. Over here we have the zero edges, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm just going to give me the full terrain, and I'm going to do at least one subdivide to this. So this is reducing, and this is adding subdivisions, it's adding more geometry in order to get the final view here. And I'm going to move to my procedural tab, this proc one right here. One of the first things that I'm probably going to do to this is take the quality boost all the way up. This is going to ensure when I get to the final actual rendering stage that it's not going to simplify the geometry when I go to render. It's going to give me the best possible render. And then I'm going to control left mouse button on top of the shader tab. Now, right now I have this set up to show all previews in the graph. If you go to this, this is probably more like what you're used to seeing in here. However, I do like to see all the previews so that I can see what happens when it comes out of the blender, when they start to connect and so on. So I'm turning all the shader balls on. The downside is that these elements, which don't really need them because you don't see much of anything, do show shader balls that have nothing in them, but so be it. In my previous video I described what this vector 3 seed was, and mentioned that this multiply by constant is here, and depending on what kind of fractals you're using or elements you're using will determine what the best kind of number is right here. Now for this simple fractal. 128 is a pretty decent value, produces a reasonable looking final object. But for our purposes, I'm just going to jump down to about 22. When using things like, let's go here, when we're using things like the terrain fractal or terrain fractal 2, 22 is pretty decent. Rocky Mountain, which is actually what we're going to be using, but there's something that we can modify to make this a little bit better. The default values for Rocky Mountain, where you change absolutely nothing and want a still decent result, the multiply can be set to about a value of 10. So 22 will give you, with the default values, pretty decent stuff from these two, and then this one, if you use 10 or rotated Rocky Mountains around 10, both of these will, with their default values, will work very well. So I'm actually going to go to the Rocky Mountains. And we're just going to click over here. And this is what I'm going to get. And just to kind of talk about the Rocky Mountain for a moment, the start off is with this kind of stained glass separation, which feels very unnatural to me, unfortunately. And that subdivision that I did just a moment ago is to allow me to really see what's going on with the Rocky Mountains. Without that, you don't see nearly as much detail, so it's fairly necessary. When using the Rocky Mountain, in order to make sure that it looks fairly decent, you have to turn off these guys, the separate mountains. Now that changes significantly how it looks. However, it doesn't have those weird separations between them, so you get something a bit more natural. And if you wanted to do just kind of like a train off in the distance, you can go ahead and you can raise the ground level, which then gives you this mountain range kind of terrain set up, and then you can blend in some other stuff to fill in the flat areas. So that's kind of the idea for when using this overall Rocky Mountain. You can do that. I'm going to keep most of the bowls in there, and I'm going to make some changes here. I'm going to set to about a 0.9 here, and I'm going to go up to about say 90 or so for the largest feature. Now, if you really want to know what they're doing, a good idea is to go ahead and start playing with these different values individually, as I did in my previous video, to really get a handle on what's happening. Now in this window, to rotate around, I'm using the right mouse button, and shift right mouse button will pan, and of course the wheel mouse once again to kind of dolly in and out. Now this section that I'm using here, this is just basically a little portion of the map based on the coordinates that I'm currently using. So if I'm happy with that, I can keep it, or I can go ahead and either change the origin in order to get a different effect, or I can change the essential origin by changing these values here. So one or the other will give me a different location. The offset moving in X and Y, and then Z is always depth, so up and down, at least in this particular tool. Y is up and down in software like Maya and XSI, but in 3D Max you have Z as depth information. And it's the same with this one. So if you want to move side to side, forwards and backwards in the train, you can go ahead and modify these guys. So I'll just remove the bits off the end here. And you'll see that updated, and it pushed that one direction. So let's go with 7. And it's moving a significant amount over to a new location. And actually, I'm fairly happy with what this is right here, so I'll go ahead and keep that. And I'm just going to pull back a little bit so I can see it a little better. It's kind of interesting. Go with that. And maybe I will shift it over a little bit. So start playing with this. So if I'm happy with this, I can continue on, or I can continue to play with things like my scale. It's going to jump me around, so I'm going to get a completely different set of information, which is also interesting. And it's just kind of finding a location that you're happy to kind of start with. So let's say this is good enough for the moment, and we'll continue forward. Actually, gives me more space to work with. Okay, so I'll continue forward with this, and the next thing that I want to do is I want to start blending with something else. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a blender. So just by selecting the Rocky Mountains, I can click on this one here. Brings me a blender. And what the blender is a node that has different kind of blend modes. This is similar to what you see in things like Photoshop, After Effects, most other compositing programs. They'll have some kind of form of blending one thing with another. And that other thing can be pretty much anything. In this particular case, I'm going to go with the Quadspinner tools, and I'm going to go ahead and load myself up something from there. So I'm going to the MDK and Supernoi and meta nodes, and I'll use a geonode, geonoi, and I'll plug that guy into my multiply, and that should give me a decent value. And if I'm not happy with the end result of this from whatever values I'm using here, like if it was the 128 and I was going to apply it to the simple fractal, then I can just go ahead and create another math node to replace that. So if you're ever wondering what any one of these things are, when you select on one, this guy is not going to do anything, but when you select on one, you'll see it highlight what it is coming from. So this multiply node is coming from right here, and so if I were to take that guy and just click this one to automatically create, it's automatically going to create one of these. So just left click will quickly give you that. And the multiply node is got a number of different options. So I mean, I could right click and have created it automatically that way, but you have all these options in here. So it's just going to create whatever you've last got. And then I could plug this guy in and change its values to 22 or 10 or whatever. But I'm happy with it, so I'm going to keep this one. And I'm going to go ahead and plug this in. Now, if I get a little bit closer, I'm not sure how visible that's going to be on the video, but you'll notice that there's two plugs, one on the right side, one on the left side. And that depends on your slider here. So the one on the left side, if I bring it all the way to this side, it's going to be the one that shows up the most, and on the right side, and over the right side will be the other connector. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in, and I'm going to plug it into displacement mapping. Now, these nodes weren't really intended to be used for this purpose. However, they work wonderfully for doing all sorts of cool stuff to your environment, your nice little procedural terrain. So one of the things that happens with this one is that there isn't a gain value that I've been able to find. Perhaps I'm completely incorrect, but in my playing, I haven't found one. So when you look at this guy has no overall gain. This guy does not. But it's okay because we're using the blender, and the blender will allow me to blend in one direction or another to add or remove a certain amount of this guy's influence, because its default setting is rather extreme. So I'm just going to go ahead and click. It's right now at a 50-50, and you're going to see what's going to happen. And that's what happens. It's a whole bunch of weird, lumpy stuff going on. And as I move towards the direction of the Rocky Mountain, which is, let me just switch these guys. You can see that this guy is on the left-hand side, this guy's on the right-hand side. If I switch it more towards the Rocky Mountain, it's going to give me less of this one and more of this guy. And you can see how it blends there. So what you can see is these little patterns coming in, which is it's kind of interesting. And I'm going to go ahead and make a modification to that. I'm actually going to take a look at these guys. Now, what I mentioned up here is you have your origin that you can play with. Well, wavelength exists on a number of things as well, and this is essentially a scale factor. So where this finds the initial center point where it picks its information from, this is a scaling of that information. So if I go to the geoannoying, it doesn't have a center point, so the only way to get a new center point would be to go through and create another vector seed, which then would require that you create another multiply by in order to get a different location. But if you want to scale it, it has its own little scale operators there. So I'm going to go ahead and change the scale of this, and it's got some default scale. You notice that they're not set at a value of 1 each, which is usually what you see with these guys. All the bottoms are usually 0, and these ones are set to 1. This one's got some resident settings in it, so you kind of have to remember these if you want to go back to them. I'm going to go ahead and make a change. I'm going to go, let's say, about 20 or so. I'll just click in the other window. Sometimes you need to double click or just right click in order to get it to update, and you'll see that it's stretched that information across there. And I'm getting some interesting little lines and such. So that's the idea. You go ahead and you can make some changes to the overall scale of that and how it breaks up across that surface, and you can get some interesting results. That'll give you something to kind of render from. If you want to see in greater detail what it's doing, of course you can always add another subdivision. However, once you get to a certain point, it will become more and more intense, I guess. Looks like I've got some artifacts going on in this rocky mountain, so I'm going to make some quick changes to this. Change subdivision quality, and I'll change that to high. And 0.7. Just trying to get rid of this artifact there, so I got rid of some of that. And here's where it's going to kind of flake out. So it disappears, but it comes back, usually. And you just have to wait a moment, and sometimes when it comes back, it will come back as, not the word color. There's a few ways that you can try and fix it to update. You can just turn the material on and off, and that will bring it back. Or you can try and change a value, and it will update that. So that got rid of the weird kind of stretching business that was going on there. So it was just a kind of a glitch of not being at a high enough sort of subdivision level or detail level. So you can get rid of those kind of errors. So there we have it. So that's one level of new information that we're putting in there. And we can continue to add multiple levels of new information by just going ahead and blending more and more into it. So let's say I want to add another fractal in here. I want to add some more kind of a bumpy business or something. I'll just click into the empty space. When you click on the blend node, because it activates this, it'll kind of graze it out. It doesn't allow you to add a blender to a blender by just clicking, so you always have to put an empty space, create the blender, and then connect it manually. So that means I can go in through there. So unplug that, plug it into here. And then of course I need my new object, so these are the fractals. So I'm going to create a fractal. It doesn't plug it in properly by default, so I'll have to take it down and plug that into here. Now in this particular case, this information that comes in, it's pretty well normalized. It's not really extreme like you see here, where this is like stark black and stark white. It's really extreme. This guy gets a lot of varying levels. Sometimes things are even too subtle to be able to see in here. Let's go to train fractal 2. So the information that it's giving me, I don't really need to reduce it too heavily before I get something that's interesting. So in this particular case, I'm just clicking to make it show up. occasionally does this weird flicker thing. This goes all over the place. There we go. And so now what I've got is a half and half, but I've lost a lot of the information that I had from before. So I don't really want to blend it in that fashion. Although I can go all the way to the side here and really determine what it is that this particular train is going to be giving to me, its overall contribution. And I can make changes to that so that I see more or less of some of these details. So I can go ahead and modify this in terms of the largest feature, metascale, etc. Bring this to 5. There we go. We can see what his contribution is. And then we could go ahead and reduce the gain on that. And we get something a bit more like that. So this is some additional details that I'm happy with. I want to add to that overall piece. So now I know what it is because I've set it all the way to this particular guy, so I know it's just him. But now I want them to actually add together. I want to add elements to each other. So what this is going to do right here is right now just blend between one or the other, and it goes 50-50, and I lose some of this information, but I gain some of that information. I don't want to work with it that way. I want to work in something else other than blend. So I'm going to switch to an additive mode. Switch to the additive mode. This slider's purpose actually changes. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that. Let me just pause. And you can see nothing's changed because this slider is now how much of this to add on top of this, not a half and half kind of deal or anything like that. This is now adding this value to this value. Now this is of course order that they're plugged in, so if I want to actually add this guy to this guy, then I have to change the direction that they're plugged into. So I'm going to go ahead and unplug this. And instead, I'm going to bring him over to this side. Doesn't really matter which side he's on, but I just need to make sure that I grab the right plug. So I'm going to grab the right side plug and put it into here. And I'll go to altitude. And him I'll plug into directly Blender. And what's going to happen now is that slider is going to add amount of this to this guy. So if I just were to update this, just so you can see what's happening. I'd pause to help with this, but I'd like to note that you have to be careful when you press undo in the software, and where you have your mouse and what you just last did, because it can kind of get confused and mess things up. It still says this is a rocky mountain, however it's reacting more like a just a regular noise, and it also removed one of my subdivisions, so it can really kind of freak out if you're not careful. So I'm just going to pause and fix it, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have to reset this rocky mountain and then reconnect it and just put the values back in. Okay, so in order to fix this, what I had to do was first of all I had to take this guy, return him back to the simple fractal, then bring him back here. And what that did, of course, is it reset all the values. When it reset all the values, I then had to put back in my inputs, -6.8 and 12.7. I had to find those locations. I had to put in my metascale, my largest feature again, change these values, separate mountains, and then everything was finally back to normal. But yet it still looked incorrect. And one of the other problems that happened was that it had also baked the original information in there, so it was doubled. So I had to unbake the information by clicking on this guy right here, which is no longer active since it's been removed. But it indicated that information had been either sculpted into it or baked into it, and this just flattens it back down to normal, just using these values to deform the plane. I did get some interesting results off of having it like that while I was playing through, but ultimately this brings me back to my nice base level. So, as I was saying, I'm going to bring it all the way down to this side now because the Rocky Mountain and the stuff here is plugged in the left-hand side when it's all the way down. Now, what base level is this, and as I go ahead and add, it's going to gradually add more of this one. So I'm going to add some of it, and then check it. It's added a little bit of that information in there. I'm going to go ahead and just dial it all the way up so that the two of them are completely combined. And you can see all of the bumps and details and other stuff are added into there. And we can continue to play with this and stretch and remove some of these features. We could add additional features to this, bring in other MDK forms. One of the first ones that I showed you at the beginning of this video was contained some of karst in it as well, and you can get some really interesting rock formations. And then of course the next step would be to go ahead and line it all up. So just had to press OK and OK, and we'll just, like I said, line it up. Preview up for us. And we can go ahead and add a material to this. So I'm going to do kind of like a snowy thing, and start that off with under the landscapes here. Just added a new material. I'm going to do the rocks and plants one because it's a darker shade. Not that the rock is actually supposed to be darker necessarily, it's just supposed to be an exposure thing, but it's best to start that off so you get the good contrast between dark and light. So I'll say OK. I'm going to control click that to bring myself into the material editor. And if you're in the basic material editor, this will say advanced. Click on advanced so you can get to this panel. Add another layer, which will be the snow. Now, what happens here is when we get another layer on top, we have this alpha boost option which appears here. And what this is basically like the opacity in the layer of Photoshop. And it just basically kind of crossfades between one and the other. So I'm just going to take that all the way up. I'm just going to make it covered in entirety, which of course is not how I'm going to want it to end up, but that's going to be my starting point. And we go over to environment, and we're going to change the slope constraint. What the slope constraint does is when it's at certain angles, it'll show this material, and when it's not, it'll show the other material. So I'm going to take that down, and I've already played with this, so I've got 58. It's a fairly reasonable amount. And you'll see that it fills in a bunch of snow in those regions. And I can go ahead and fuzz that out a little bit. Let's go for 6%. Allow it to fade in a little bit into some of these other regions, and we get some interesting snow coverage. So the final step is of course going ahead and doing a final render, but you can already see what's going on right here. And continue to tweak your form. Add different kinds of elements together until you finally get something that you really like. You can get some interesting kind of patterns that may look sort of like erosion or just some interesting breakup. So that's making use of the Quadspinner MDK set within here. the ones that I've discovered that will work the best for this type of stuff, of course, is the Rock Breaker set and the Super Noise set, but Clockmaker can also produce some interesting sort of results if you play with it. And that's it. Cheers.